Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our webinar on Beyond Basic Data, which we'll talk about today, how to unleash the power of your business data with geospatial insights and data enrichment. My name's Tim McKenzie. Good to meet you guys. Joining me today is Colin Madison and David Mosher. And so you may be wondering, what's this all about? Well, we're going to talk about data today. So in organizations today, we're seeing an exploding need for trusted data. More and more companies are wanting to make decisions based upon data. A little bit less about gut, a little less about feeling, a whole lot more about data and what does data say. So we're seeing CEOs say that, yes, this is definitely the direction we want to go. They're putting their money where their mouth is by investing heavily in data. Infrastructure is growing, and 68% of all Fortune 1000 businesses now have actually hired someone to manage data within their organization. You can go to the next slide. So when we think about data, data is great, right? If we get to use it right, and if we can take advantage of the data. And when we think about spatial data, it represents actually some of its own unique challenges, but it also represents a significant amount of opportunity to an organization. So this is kind of I guess a rough sketch of what an organization might be thinking when they're challenged with the task of, hey, how can we enrich our data from a location perspective to make better decisions? We hear comments like these on this slide every day, honestly, as we interact with you guys as our customers. We hear top-down initiatives from leadership to make better data-driven decisions, which then elicits a lot of questions, right? Well, okay, so I'm a bank and I need to enrich financial trades to better understand those transactions, to detect anomalies, to detect fraud. How do I enrich this data? And then others, some data that we might be using within the organization is very private or is not private. And how do we know the difference? How do we know what data we can use, what data we can't use for a data-driven initiative? Then we oftentimes struggle with data quality. Why are there duplicate records? Why do I see data that says the same thing twice? Why do I see data that should say the same thing once, but it says two different things? Or as we get further along to the right, how do I actually take action on things? How do I stop writing policies? This is a great example from insurance in a hurricane area, but I can't figure out which policies actually are in the area, so I can't really stop writing policies. Therefore, our agents keep writing policies, even though we know that a hurricane's coming to that area right now. And if we think about compliance, how can I make sure that the data that I'm using is compliant for the use case in which I'm delivering some sort of insight? At the end of the day, we hear leadership say, hey, there's got to be a better way. We know that there's strategic advantages to using location data, but we know that there's challenges inherent to this, which along comes precisely, honestly, and that's what we'll talk about next. So next slide. So when we think about, from the precisely perspective, when we think about data, we think about it from the context of data integrity. So we see increasingly our customers desiring to take advantage of data, much like we just talked about, but also recognizing that they need accuracy, they need consistency, and they need context to the data in order to make sure that they're making good decisions. We as a company have approached this from a variety of different viewpoints, starting from integration, helping our customers find data within the organization and bringing it together into meaningful applications or platforms where they can gain new insights. We see customers coming at us and needing to govern data, to better understand the quality of data, better understand the use of that data, better manage the use of that data and access of the data, to ensure things like compliance and privacy. We see our customers coming to us desiring to improve the quality of their data so that they can make trustworthy decisions. And then what we're going to talk about for the rest of today are these last two components, which are location and enrichment. Increasingly, we're seeing our customers looking for new ways to gain a competitive edge in whatever business they're doing by putting location attribution to data that they've always had inside their organization, and then enriching that location perspective with additional attributes to do fun things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, advanced analytics. And we'll talk about the rest of this time, we'll spend talking about different ways in which we see customers taking advantage of location data, and then we'll finish up with some location based use cases specific to customer examples. And I think, Colin, we'll go to you next to maybe help us get a foundation for how this all starts as we begin to think about how to bring spatial data into operational data stores within a business. Colin?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So I wanted to just set a really a baseline for everybody, because data, geospatial data, means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And within different industries, you'll hear different terminology: geolocation, location, spatial. So we take a address-centric approach to this. And so you'll see, and also a very privacy-sensitive approach to it. But the data that precisely offers to add that additional context to all the rich information businesses are capturing. We add address and property attribution to give them deeper insight into what's happening at a location, how many buildings are there, things of that nature. Boundaries, to be able to say it's in this country, it's in this zip code, it's in this neighborhood. Adding demographics, and those demographics, I mentioned privacy before, those are going to be aggregated details about people. We often get asked about sensitive data, movement data, things of that nature. We want to just kind of come out and kind of say we offer demographics, which will avoid that PII concern you may have. In addition, there's a need to understand businesses, and there's a lot of complexity to understanding, is a business owned by a parent? How many employees are there? What kinds of businesses operate in this location? And so points of interest really satisfy a lot of that. And then there's street data that helps understand, how many customers are within a 10-mile drive, or, what kind of things are happening in this location. And then additionally, there's a lot of really rich risk attribution. And so understanding things around weather, fire, and flood are really important for, anything insurance, mortgage, building things out like telecommunications and utilities as well. So this is kind of how we organize geospatial data and the way we look at spatial data. With that kind of describes how we add that additional context. And so we've got a lot of customers using these different data sets. We're going to go into next, kind of go into some of the ways geospatial data can solve these business problems. There's many different ways, as you guys can imagine, but we're going to kind of go through a few that we've seen, common patterns that we see that I think will be beneficial. So with that, I'm going to take the first example and talk about how e-commerce user experience is really driven by being able to add that additional context. So you'll see in this slide, there's a few different things. There's being able to complete the auto-complete the address. So we've all typed in our address, and typically that's the first step in the e-com user experience, is determining, am I eligible to purchase this? If I'm trying to buy something, if I live in France and they only serve the US, they need to know that immediately. If they only serve within a certain number of miles, that's really important. And so typically we see people manually entering the data, and that's a really bad thing. None of us are perfect typers. And so, there's a way that autocomplete, as you start to type, you've probably seen this, after you get to character 5 or 6, it starts to offer you known addresses, and you can select that. Also really important, you'll see that one of the examples says 4 addresses. People very rarely offer their unit number, and so that can be really difficult from an e-commerce perspective. If there's 50 units or 500 units in my complex and I don't give them the unit number, it's going to be, kind of a 50-50 if I end up with my item. After that kind of initial look, there's also the being able to determine if mail can be delivered there by the postal service, or if an alternative carrier needs to be brought in. And so being able to validate the address is a really important component as well. Knowing the time window that they're going to be able to deliver in, knowing that I received mail. And so there's a lot of kind of nuances to the way mail is pushed out and packages are delivered. And it's really hard for e-com kind of organizations to keep on top of that. And then beyond that, there's also the need to be able to get it to the correct location. And so the geocoding, once they actually have the address, they need to be able to get to the house, get to the, the front porch and deliver that item. And so the accuracy of the latitude and longitude is really critical because, there's instances where, if they just get to the street that you're on or where it says the address is, that might not be close enough, that might not be accurate enough. And so that's really powerful. There's also this idea of, we talked about enrichment, you'll see there's a unique identifier. And so that makes adding that context and knowing that the address is the same as the latitude and longitude or the same as that location, linking the address to that location or empowered by that unique ID.
Yes. So,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, it's funny you bring this up too, Colin, because I just had a conversation about these concerns specifically with a telecommunication group earlier this afternoon. And their primary issue was actually trying to figure out what to do with all of these legacy addresses within their billing system. So we had a billing system in place. I think they stood it up, the old system itself, in about 2002 or 2003 timeframe. And now just recently, they've lifted and shifted that data over into a new environment, but they're running into the same exact headache they ran into, years ago, because there's just a lot of bad information being added to now the new system that was in the old system. And so we started to talk to them about actually the ability to leverage auto address complete capabilities to really refine that match, keep it consolidated to trusted referential matches, trusted matches from these referential data sources, and also back that with authoritative information as well, as you had mentioned too. So albeit from a tax assessment perspective or defining and identifying deliverability of certain things, because different addresses are going to be used for different purposes. Bill can be sent to a location, but can service be provided to that same location? A PO box isn't going to have service. A PO box can get mailed to it, but certainly not going to hook up to any sort of wired or wireless services. That being said, but it's really funny that you're saying this from an e-commerce perspective, how useful this is. But same exact thing goes in turn with actually avoiding any sort of, to your point, duplicative information being added or just bad address information being added to any system that might contain address information. Sorry, I cut you off, Tim.
No, that's a great example, and I think there's, I guess, some unrealized value in putting that type ahead element into lots of different business systems to make sure that we have address data, the good quality address data to start the process. I was just thinking of, Colin, maybe a little bit of an extension off of this e-commerce use case, which I've seen, 3-4 times in the last couple months. And that is, if we think about delivery now. So every company that's delivering to your door, not every, but most, are now taking a picture, of that delivery, which is actually meaning that they're carrying a device and an app with them as they carry the box from their truck to your front door. And I've been exposed to now 3 or 4 different use cases where companies are trying to take advantage of that app and the movement of that driver or delivery person from wherever they park the car to the front door, and then trying to figure out ways to make use of that data. So now picture, I think you talked about an apartment complex, right? With multiple buildings, multiple parking areas, multiple apartment units inside of a building. Well, how do you help the driver get to the right unit as fast as possible? And what we're starting to see is our customers are increasingly using machine learning to take those tracks, so to speak, of that app. So picture I parked in front of an apartment complex, I followed the sidewalk on the left side and I came up to the door, and then I dropped off on the second floor, third apartment from the right. The next guy goes the other way. He walks up the sidewalk on the other side. Increasingly though, we can start to time those patterns and then use machine learning to tie which of those sidewalk paths actually gives you the fastest travel route up to the second floor, third apartment on the right. And our ID structure now gives you a way to organize that path to a given address and a given ID to really operationalize the whole thing. So all kinds of fun stuff going on in this environment that truly is making businesses better and more accurate, getting happier customers and more efficient, processes. So
yeah.
Something I wanted to add. Yeah. Something I was going to add there as well is a challenge that comes up constantly is trying to keep up with gate codes, which change, which are hard to find. Yes. And so a blind spot for some of the retailers we've spoken with is they don't know if Unit A gives a gate code when they buy something, but they don't know that. So when Unit C buys it, they don't know to say, hey, could you give us the gate code? We know that you live in a gated community. And so there's these challenges that are really difficult. Another thing you brought up was taking the photographs. I've also heard, it's really beneficial for, what you described as kind of some of the last mile. It also helps them understand and get on top of some of the fraud where drivers are keeping stuff and saying they delivered it. There are certain things that are happening. And so as they're trying to use data to kind of, minimize that and increase their, deliveries to perfect, because every time it comes back and they have to redeliver it, it's very expensive. So, knowing about the building, knowing that there's a gate code, and, kind of creating some sort of, undercover boss way to do this. Some of them are actually going out and experiencing it. Some of the people that run these operations experiencing the delivery to see, what could go wrong. So it's an interesting space.
Yeah, and when you talk to a lot of these groups too, and keep me honest here, Tim and Colin, but they're really struggling with how to include location context in any of their use cases or any of their business processes. And they say to themselves, well, we're lacking that. But an easy into that is definitely through the address, right? I mean, if you've got an address, you've got location potential. Right. And so we're seeing a lot of the kind of the blending of the worlds, because all of our customers have address information. They have customers, they have locations they deliver to, they have businesses they work with. So an address lives and breathes in all of these groups that we work with, our client base. And so therefore, it's an easy way to get into this concept of location enrichment and providing more context and information that might be pertinent to those use cases that require additional detail or additional context to really resolve those issues. So the address is that easy in across the board, no matter what vertical we're speaking with or what client we're talking to. That's a great way to start enriching and improving that business process overall as well.
Absolutely. All right, I think we've talked enough about e-commerce. So let's switch to the next topic. So I think, Colin, you've been talking about, okay, if we have an address, what do we do? So I'll spend a couple minutes and talk about, okay, if we have a point on a map, a latitude and longitude, and oftentimes those points on a map are from a device of some sort. So a mobile device or an IoT device of some sort. So meaning it's probably indicating there's a person there or a thing there. And how do we take advantage of this understanding of this person or thing to then create some sort of business value? In this case, this is one example. There's many, and you guys might end up thinking of one as we talk through this. I don't know. But in this case, think about, we've all got received alerts on our device. A lot of times it's for an emergency situation or some sort of criminal activity or lost person, all kinds of different alerts. Oftentimes, I don't know about you, but I get alerts that are for things that happened not really anywhere near where I am. And that oftentimes is because we think about the wireless network. A wireless tower speaks to a broad area, and a wireless tower lacks context. It just knows what devices it can touch. So in the case of emergency alerting, if certain towers are triggered to send out an alert, well, guess what? That tower is going to send that alert to anyone that's connected to that given piece of telecommunications equipment. So there are ways to make this better, and there's an important reason to make it better, right? So if 90% of the alerts that come to my phone are irrelevant to me because I don't live close to wherever that event is happening, guess what I'm going to probably do? I'm going to probably start to ignore most of those alerts. So if we can enable the alerts to be more relevant to my location, it increases the likelihood that I will pay attention to them. So let's go to the next slide to show how we have, again, this is just one use case where we're using machine learning, location data, in this case boundaries, and then the presence of mobile devices to build a smarter alerting system. So in this case, you see all these dots on the map. Well, guess what? That's mobile devices. The shapes on a map indicate areas of I think the one up top on the north side of Tom Landry Freeway is a neighborhood. The one on the bottom, I believe, is Six Flags. So it's a amusement park. And so in this case, an event happened inside of Six Flags. Well, yes, we probably ought to let some of these other people know, but we probably don't need to let everyone know about an event that happened specific in Six Flags. So in this case, we're using machine learning. We're using boundaries around popular locations, places, to then limit the transmission of that alert to only an area that where the users are actually inside the park. So in this case, it's a mix of location boundaries, wireless devices, and then some machine learning to understand and predict, because you probably would want to alert people that are maybe in the parking lot, but maybe not necessarily people that are up there, 2 roads north, East Copeland Road, I think is where it is, to this event. So again, just an idea, and the concept here is the importance of, if we have mobile devices, if we have IoT devices, the opportunity to provide context around that lat long, so that you can start to make actionable business decisions.
And I just wanted to add in there, this comes up a whole lot, and people love to use zip codes. It's kind of the first step in using some sort of location element to be smarter, to be more targeted. But for some use cases, the zip code's just way too big. My zip code is massive. I could get alerts that are 10 miles away. So there's zip codes are kind of where people start, but they want these boundaries that are more useful, and also that people are familiar with. So people aren't really familiar with zip codes. They don't know their census block. So neighborhoods and census, or city boundaries, municipal boundaries, I live in this city, I live in this neighborhood, are usually what people prefer, and kind of what resonates more with them. So
and
those are really important.
And thinking about this from a device perspective too, is that we worked with a insurance company that was actually providing auto coverage. And what they were trying to do was analyze whether or not their drivers were quote unquote safe drivers. And so, Colin, back to what you were mentioning at the beginning of the conversation, when it comes to how we really kind of approach the data world, or rather enrichment, and how we address certain needs, what they needed was essentially street data. So they wanted to actually understand the speed limit pertaining to those road segments or street segments that they were on, and also understand whether or not, because they were tracking, point to point as the car was moving along the highway or along the street segment, and understanding how fast they were going in between there was one thing they could absolutely do, but what they weren't aware of was what was the posted speed limit. So all of a sudden, then they started providing actually discounts to safe drivers and increasing rates to those non-safe drivers. And so I thought that was a really interesting use case when it comes to even additional device type information, or device type points outside of just pure mobile information.
I personally don't like that use case, Dave.
I'm gonna
because I think my rates would go up.
I wanted to piggyback off of what Dave just said, because he mentioned from an insurance perspective, there's also this idea of gamification, and I mentioned kind of the fraud where you've got drivers that maybe keep some of the stuff, and that's an issue. There's a gamification of, if you do your deliveries but you're driving safely, rewarding those drivers that are not cutting neighborhoods, especially if you've got some sort of company logo on the vehicle. You don't want that car cutting gas stations or taking shortcuts. So using street data intelligence to say, we're going to gamify it, we're going to reward you, is also a way we're seeing some of the kind of retailers leverage some of the location information out there to drive better behavior. So
and even that kind of doubling down kind of concept too, Colin. So if you're delivering for 2 different groups, albeit food delivery or shopping delivery, or grocery delivery, we've had some instances where those groups have come to us and said, "Hey, can you tell us if these individuals are doubling down? We noticed a slowdown in actually delivery rate, and we don't understand why they're making stops at these locations." Well, sometimes they're stopping at the same location multiple times, right, at that grocery store on the way to actually drop off the food, for said restaurant, so on and so forth. So there's also that kind of concept too, from not a fraudulent perspective, but just awareness, right? And further in kind of enhancing that kind of safe driver concept and avoiding those kind of fraudulent activities too, to a certain degree.
I've also heard it from more of the, they're both doing pickup and drop off, and they're doing food delivery. And so making sure that they're only on the clock for you when they say they're on the clock for you is something you may want to be able to, determine.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, fantastic use cases.
I wanted to add
we could go on and on and on about some of these things, but let's keep it moving. I think my role was designated MC, so we'll keep rolling through this. Dave, I think next you are going to talk about some of the things and trends we've seen in operationalizing location data to make it more of an automatic process. So
100%, Tim, and so absolutely, we're seeing, because of to what Tim had mentioned at the top of the call, was of course this explosion of the need, and also just the general volumes itself of both location data as well as address information. And we also understand that there's a need to proactively monitor this information as well, from a location perspective or enrichment perspective, or even just awareness of changes in volumes and fluctuations of those critical data sets or assets that are being leveraged in some sort of business process. And so in this case, what we're actually seeing is the ability, the need itself for awareness and alerting associated with changes to these critical data elements, because as the volumes of these data continues to increase, also as changes to those data elements that you're utilizing in some sort of business process downstream that's critical to your business, you're going to want to be aware of that. So alerting associated with these types of things certainly occur, or certainly necessary. And so in this instance, what we're seeing here is actually the need from a P&C or insurance perspective of actually awareness associated with volumes and changes in exposure based upon current events. So wildfire perimeter, distance to those wildfire perimeters, but also the ability for the business to be alerted when you see a certain amount of locations or policies enforced that are falling within a given distance from those fire perimeters, or even potentially within it, because that then of course lends downstream to how much you might be liable for. And also you want to make sure that you're providing protection as best as you can to your policyholders. So the ability to proactively monitor not just changes and fluctuations in the data, but how that directly ties to actually customer service and customer stat, and also, of course, just pure protection associated with actually what you're able to provide to these locations is certainly critical, because in certain instances we have P&C groups that are actually lending out actually independent fire companies, firefighting companies in these situations. So it's nice to know and be aware of what locations are closest to those perimeters or falling within it, to essentially provide them with the coverage to say, hey, listen, we can send out an independent fire company. Would you like us to do that? So on and so forth, just to provide not only just the family itself living at those locations or individuals, but also the home. And so definitely a trend and change to your point, Tim, as it pertains to, of course, operationalizing this data then leads to, of course, the need to proactively monitor and ensure that you're observing any sort of changes. And of course, more importantly, the impacts of those changes on your book of business in this instance for these PNCs.
Yeah, great example. For sure. And I think we've seen similar type use cases in lots of industries where location data is creating some sort of insight, and that insight calls for action if an insight drops below a threshold or above a threshold. Yep. So this is a great way, using some of our newer technology, to be able to observe those data sets and create action against them. So maybe to keep things rolling, because I think we spent maybe a little bit more time than I anticipated on those other ones. I think we'll move over to customer examples. I just realized I think I'm next, so I'll take this first one. So yeah, so I chose this one to talk about because I think it's somewhat relevant to what's going on in the economy today. But this actually was a use case we delivered a few years ago, but it's bubbled back up as one that's of important interest today. So we all are hearing about the stress that small and mid-sized banks are feeling today on their liquidity. In this case, we're coming at it from the perspective of their book of mortgage business. We do a lot of work within the mortgage space, from prop tech to mortgage underwriters to large national mortgage reinsurers. So lots of different spaces within this industry, really because of our deep insights into location and our ability to leverage some of the things that Colin talked about earlier, which is this unique ID structure to give a common way of talking about a property, so that users or individuals that touch the life cycle of a mortgage can know with confidence they're talking about the same property throughout the life cycle, to lots of the data sets, that Colin talked about, that we can easily connect to a location to begin to do some of the fun stuff that we're talking about here. So if we think about mortgage, and we think about understanding and assessing the value of a property and then the size of the loan, and when those two are in harmony, banks feel happy, right? So if you owe considerably less than your home is worth, the bank tends to be happy because they have recourse that can cover if you decide that you don't feel like paying your mortgage anymore. But banks are very, very sensitive when those two numbers start to get closer together. So in this case, a large National Mortgage Association was looking for a better way to enable their mortgage companies at these smaller banks to have a really, really accurate assessment of the value of properties. So when we say really, really accurate, so the traditional way has always been, let's look at the value of the property sold. Let's look at comps, so comparable sales close by. Let's look at, if we sold a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house on a half acre, let's go find other 3-bedroom, 2-bath houses on half acres, and we'll compare to see if the sales price is comparable to the loan value of a property. Or you might look at MLS listings. So what are houses being listed for in an area? Or you might look at things like, okay, what are the appraisals saying about home valuations in that area? These, to some degree, are helpful, but without context, you can easily make bad decisions. So I think I know I can look at my neighborhood and I can look out my window and about 100 yards the other way is a different neighborhood. And the home values between my neighborhood and that neighborhood are dramatically different. The houses, the sizes of the houses look similar, but it's not intuitive that a house in one of our neighborhoods would be more expensive than the other. So in this case, this mortgage association decided, let's take a different approach. Let's look for other contextual data that we can bring in along with appraisals and home sales. And then let's apply that data to an artificial intelligence model to see if we can gain new insights about what properties truly are comparable. So in this case, they came to us looking for context, and we provided that. We provided things like neighborhood boundaries. We provided things like school districts. We provided things like demographics in an area. County assessor records to give an insight in terms of the tax burden, HOA boundaries, so that to understand what type of HOA fees were paid. And then a really cool thing, I think, is amenities. So amenity scores, understanding the proximity of important, vital parts of living, like how far is it to get to a grocery store? How far is it to get to medical care? What about public transit? Or on the other side, on more high-end areas, like that neighborhood next to me, how close is it to a Lululemon shop or a high-end coffee store or some fancy purse store or a good restaurant? So using other contextual variables ingested with a national database of all historical sales over a fixed period of time, they're able to ingest this data into cloud-based environments using first machine learning to identify the features that are most predictive of price changes, and then using AI to then use historical trends to predict impacts on future valuations based upon the mix of appraisals and valuations and all of these amenities that I described. At the end of the day, using the cloud, using artificial intelligence, they were able to reduce the time to insights significantly, which means that they can update this model much faster. And in today's economy right now, updating models in hours versus days in timeliness is incredibly important. So this is just one example of ways that we're seeing, and I didn't even really talk about this, but all of our location attributes are represented as shapes on a map, but they're also represented as rows and columns on a spreadsheet, so to speak. So taking our unique ID structure for properties and picture thousands of attributes that would describe the people, the places, the things that would be going on at a given location enables the easy use of our data inside of artificial intelligence, machine learning capabilities. So this is one example just of how we're able to create data sets at scale that create context around a business problem to enable a business customer, in our case, this mortgage association, the ability to gain new insights that they wouldn't have been able to have before.
I think you hit on an important point too, Tim, is the timeliness factor, right? I mean, the biggest thing is what we're doing behind the scenes by pre-associating or pre-enriching this address information with rich context associated with that for whatever use case it might be. So for instance, with an insurer we work with, same exact thing was happening, right? Pre-enrichment, pre-association, pre-processing to expedite the quote process. So when an individual reaches out and says, hey, I would like a quote pertaining to my home, pertaining to my business, let's try and produce it as quickly as possible so we can get that in their hands before they go someplace else to start asking questions to potentially sign up for coverage with them. So absolutely, timeliness is definitely a big thing right now, big topic.
Great example. So Colin, were we going to you next? I can't remember.
Yeah, that's right. So this next one, we've kind of got an example use case, which I'm definitely going to go into. But before I go kind of diving into the specific, I think it's important to kind of lay out the overarching message. And so, in this case, we had a global on-demand video streaming platform that wanted to go from, having a market to having the world as their market. And it's really challenging to go out and license additional, understand all these different places. There's a lot of places, and the speed of data refresh and the, quality of the data everywhere is really challenging. And so in this case, this organization wanted to make sure that as they did their global expansion, they were able to kind of meet their requirements, grow their customer base, things of that nature. And so they were looking at, how do we associate each device to a location, because if we want to, offer one set of services, in this market, in April, we want to offer a different set of services in, May, and then something else in June, being able to associate that, and that's, down to a city, down to a neighborhood. So without that kind of context, it's really hard to manage their content. And then additionally, with these big platforms that are supporting, worldwide customer bases, having the right amount of compute and kind of machines spun up for certain events, being able to scale it up and down to make sure that they're delivering a good experience, really challenging. And so that's kind of another component of this. So, they had a kind of a challenge and a blind spot, being able to grow subscribers, being able to predict that, that throughput and kind of being able to manage usage and requirements. And so using spatial analytics and enrichment in the form of, in this case, global boundaries, they are able to identify the location and better plan their streaming, better handle target marketing, and deliver a better customer experience. So, kind of several kind of, values kind of came out of that. So if you move to the next one, we'll kind of go into a few of the pieces there. So, this is a contiguous set of boundaries for the entire world. So instead of having to go to, we're looking at Asia right now, go to China for one set of boundaries, Japan, Vietnam, India, and have to deal with language nuances. This is one comprehensive data set, everything in English, as well as translated into the native character set. So if you're, interacting with the customer through a device, you can interact, and show stuff in their information. And then there's also, Tim talked about that hierarchical approach to an address. We also take this hierarchical approach to structuring the boundary data. So, we're able to say this device is in this neighborhood, it's in this city, it's in this county, it's in this state or province, it's in this country, all from one set of data. So it's really powerful. Postal code, we talked about that a little earlier, being able to look at both a postal code perspective as well as being able to identify the city. Let's go ahead and move to the next one. There's one more thing I wanted to touch on. So neighborhoods, really complicated to capture, and so that's covered in 83 countries, 1,000 biggest metros. So as cities are too big, Chicago isn't necessarily meaningful for some use cases. You want to know which zip code it's in. Being able to get down to that neighborhood is really powerful. And then disputed territories and time zones are something else that comes up often. Being able to make sure that you're communicating with people in the way they want to at the time they're available and working, or things of that nature, as well as being able to turn things off in certain areas. So there's areas that are sensitive, and so these disputed territories can be really important for a customer experience. I want to make sure I'm delivering it in the language or in use this set of messaging for this campaign based on where we know this device is and the political sensitivity of that. So that's something that's pretty unique. And then this is updated quarterly, and cities are changing constantly. Country boundaries, as we're all familiar, are changing. What's disputed, wars happen, and we need to reflect that in our data so that our customers don't have to handle that on their own. So a lot of deep spatial insights to help power those platform kind of global use cases.
I know I have often underappreciated the complexity when you think about operating a business at a global scale and you're trying to understand the location of businesses or create context on anything from a global perspective, language barriers, having to source all these different boundaries. You know, I ran into a use case just this week, which was a global manufacturer who's trying to predict availability of supply chain. So tracking incoming goods into their manufacturing locations. And when we started talking about the ability to tag the movement of those trucks across boundaries as they got closer and closer to each of those plants, they were shocked because they had not thought that that was something that they could easily pull off with a single type of solution. They thought it was a fairly complex thing that would take quite a bit of engineering. And the reality is you turn these into geofences. So as trucks or packages are starting to move from one country to the next and into the state in which that manufacturing facility is located, into the city, into the neighborhood, now they can know with increasing accuracy the availability of those goods to begin whatever manufacturing. And that's just one of, I think we could go on, but I do think we're running out of time. But we could talk a lot about the value of some of these global data sets to provide deep insights from a global perspective. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, and even thinking about it too, Tim, it's not just the boundary pre-made, pre-built boundary sets that are critical for certain use cases, right? When you're thinking about the need to create catchment areas for different things, right? So
Yep.
we were talking about it. We were talking with a property technology company recently, looking to build catchment areas pertaining to drive time and drive distances around a rental property, or walk times and walk distance around those rental companies or rental locations, because what they wanted to do was provide essentially the benefits of staying at those locations, right? How close am I to the Golden Gate Bridge? How close am I to the Statue of Liberty? How do I get there? So there's all these concepts of, if you're staying at a rental location, wouldn't it be nice to know what you're staying around? And that's exactly what we do actually provide, coverage for globally as well, is the ability to build these custom polygons to then pull information, pertinent information pertaining to, now in that case, of course, the people that are staying at a certain host location for this company we're working with. So just another kind of factor to kind of play in there. And I think I'll kind of roll into actually my final slides here.
There you go.
Probably should have put a little bit more work into my slides, because I think Tim and Colin, your slides are definitely a little bit prettier than mine. But at the same time, what we were doing recently is, or rather, what I wanted to step through was a use case that we worked on with a leading telecommunications group based in the U.S. Now they have actually complete national coverage. So their coverage area spans all 50 states. And what they were trying to do was essentially create this location data center of excellence. And so that's why you see that kind of data in the center here. And by creating that kind of location data center of excellence, what they quickly realized was a lot of that data was siloed, right? It was actually kept in a certain part of the organization and not utilized across the organization in the way, shape, or form it should be. So if you continue to kind of build this slide out for me, what we saw is, again, kind of those data silos in place that were built primarily around, of course, the way they had, of course, run their business in the past, but also what they encountered was issues through mergers and acquisitions, because they were growing quite rapidly, expanding throughout the U.S. And because of those silos, they really weren't able to actually commingle across to understand okay, where are we providing coverage? Where do we provide certain services? Where are there green fields or green spaces where we should be, where we know we can be, but what are we missing out on? So the data siloing, and of course that impact then led into, of course, discrepancies between disparate systems as well. So data not being able to be pushed and leveraged across the organization itself led into the need or requirement around the ability to replicate the data, or data integration requirements to move the data from one source to another target, to what Tim had mentioned earlier, from legacy systems into modern day systems, who had both mainframes in-house, as well as leveraging cloud data warehouses like Databricks and Snowflake. So the need to move the data to reuse that data was important. And then from there, what we started to understand was actually there was a need itself to really begin kind of qualifying out that information before it was being distributed across the organization as well. Because if you're going to leverage the same data set, and create that location data center of excellence, you're going to have to provide some sort of qualification and data quality around that data as well. Because as we were talking about before, an address requires data quality, standardization of that information before any sort of erroneous information is used in any sort of business case or use case within the business. And on top of that too, it lends its hand very well to what they also identified as a need is governance. So the ability to actually identify who should be utilizing certain data sets, where certain data sets are coming from, what's being done with those data sets. Also, if somebody made a change to certain data sets because they're reporting information up to the FCC, who made that change? When was it made? And so they're aware of those issues and can rectify or reconcile those concerns as well. So data governance put up the appropriate stewardship around that information to ensure that that data is kept in the best format possible. And then as it continues to kind of build out, what they then realized pretty shortly after that is that there was a need for additional information, for additional context. So on top of location analytics, if you build that out one more time for me here, there was a need itself for location enrichment. Because now what they had is they had an awareness of what data they had, where the data needed to be or where the data was coming from, the appropriate stewardship around that information, specifically when it came to PII information and also the best quality information possible. And soon they realized, okay, now I've got all this information, what am I missing? So the context we brought into play here was critical for them around the property to identify serviceability, to identify what services should be provided to those locations that were in their coverage areas, and also understanding, what type of consumers or what type of, consumers actually live at those locations to market accordingly to them as well. So this location data center of excellence concept really builds into the broader need of, first and foremost, understanding the importance to break down those data silos, ensure the best quality information, also the appropriate stewardship around that data and who controls it and who has access to it. And then from there, the identification of what's missing and the context we can bring through our unique ID system, through Precisely ID, as Tim and Colin had mentioned, or even just spatial processing, identification of what boundaries a certain location falls within to identify whether or not it did fall within a given node boundary where they do provide certain types of services. But I thought this was a powerful use case based upon a discussion we've had recently.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, this slide encapsulates what we're seeing within a lot of our enterprise customers. If you roll back 10, maybe even 5 years ago, location data, location functions typically were segregated to the map guys. And the map guys did the work, and then they were tasked with building some sort of intuitive, nice map because no one else really knew how to interact with location data. But today, we're seeing the operationalizing of location data so that it becomes treated just like any other data asset within a company, with proper governance, with proper integration into applications, with the enabling of a business decision in an automated way out of the data. So to me, this is a great example of that. We're just about done here. We had several questions, but I think I'm going to pick two. One, Colin, I think this one, you probably know the answer to this one, but the question is, do we offer any type of mobile data products, and maybe describe those?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm sure that slide you showed where we had all those device points at the Six Flags, I've actually been to that Six Flags, probably prompted that question. So it's a good question. We don't provide any of that data. We do use, in some of our data sets, we use movement data to derive insights, which we provide to our customers. So Dave talked about geofences. I talked about them a little bit. So being able to say, there's this much activity at, this particular retailer, this shopping center, this, I think that entertainment venue is another great example. And then we can show where they came from, but that's all going to be anonymized at either a census block group level or an Uber hex, if you guys are familiar with those. So all of it's going to be, we take that data, that movement data, mobile data, to build insights to deliver those. But we're not in the business of selling any of that data because we don't want to kind of run into that privacy stuff. Right. We take a very, cautious approach. We've been kind of ahead of the curve on that, where we wanted to be, and because we're a global company and we serve a lot of global customers, we had to be GDPR aware when that started, and then California. So we don't sell mobile data, but we use that to kind of build dynamic insights into what's happening at a location.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And back to the privacy thing, that's what we're all about. Maybe to piggyback, since you said, this question probably came from that Six Flags example. So an example of the type of insights we would give would be at Six Flags on Monday, there were X number of people showing up at Six Flags. And here's a generic demographic profile of those people as compared to there were X minus 10% on Tuesday, and here's a generic demographic profile of them. And our customers would tend to use that. I don't know who would be close to that. Whatever, some other amusement event location maybe close by would then use that data plus insights about visits to their own park per se to understand the difference in demographics, to understand the difference in counts of people attending those two different parks. Probably a more relevant example would be, ATM locations or bank branches or shoe stores, where you're trying to better understand the population that shows up at your place compared to somebody else's. But all that's great. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, or even competitive intel too, Tim. If you're thinking about this, is how many people, if I'm Target, how many people visited Walmart at this specific point in time during this day versus actually my store right across the street. So what's going on here, right? Did we not outreach accordingly? What's going, so those kind of insights, specifically from a competitive perspective, is where we see a lot of our data sets being used, because you don't need PII information in there for that reason.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In some of the interesting tests, people thought that seems like a lot of people at this location at one time. And when they went back and looked, there was like a book signing at a Barnes and Noble, which, drove that number way up. And so, it's interesting, but it's very powerful and accurate. Go ahead. Looks like
I think this is a prompt from our back end supervisor telling us to hurry up. So I will say there was one last question maybe that I'd hit on. We mentioned a couple times analytic platforms and where do we tend to do this processing. We absolutely can do it in our environment. So we offer cloud environments that are SaaS-based that we can host a lot of the processes that we've described today. But additionally, we see our customers using platforms like Databricks, like Snowflake, AWS SageMaker, even compute platforms like EMR, AWS Elastic MapReduce to do a lot of this heavy-duty processing to get to the insights that we've talked about today. But maybe just to wrap it all up, 3 key strategies that we're seeing repeated with the use of our products to deliver these business processes. One is around organizing data from a unique and persistent ID. Second is enriching that ID structure with a bunch of data assets, which we described some. We offer actually about 9,000 attributes, so we didn't describe all of them. And then ultimately powering all this into analytic platforms to do high-powered analysis to gain new insights. So thank you very much for showing up today. We appreciate your attendance, and please let us know if you have any questions.